God. We have all these different denominational religions in this country, and they're teaching theological error. It just makes me ill to think of how they are manipulating people just like politicians do. They take Romans, the 13th chapter, and they say that government is a higher power, and that we have to be subject to government. The first sentence of Romans, the 13th chapter, says this: let every soul be subject to the higher powers. That word "every" is inclusive of everybody. George W. Bush, Obama, all the rest of them, Harry Reid, and Pelosi, and all of them. They're part of that "every," aren't they?
They don't know it.
They're supposed to be subject to the higher powers. That's what the Bible says. They're supposed to be subject to the higher power. Every one of them took an oath to uphold and defend that Constitution. And the Constitution is the higher power than they, isn't it? Are they honoring their oath? I should say not. They don't know how serious it is when they take these oaths, I'll tell you. I like to send these people to the 149th Psalm. If you never compared this with Romans 13, you want to do it. King David had gotten in big trouble right at the end of his reign because he had ordered the numbering of the people. Remember what I was saying? Who pays? Who pays for the mistakes that politicians make? 70,000 men of the Israelite people lost their lives, died, because they allowed their king to violate God's commandments, God's law. A plague came on them. There was no check there. They didn't come out and say, hey, King David, you can't do this. God doesn't approve of it. And a plague came on, and if you want to read that story, go to 2 Samuel, the 23rd chapter. Read it. Read it 4 or 5 times, because it'll finally come through how the people of Israel were worshiping their king. King David, they loved King David. He was a great military leader. He was a great king, the greatest king that old Israel ever had. But he ordered the numbering of the people, and that wasn't according to God's plan. And so 70,000 people died. He wrote the 149th Psalm. And in there he said, let everyone have a two-edged sword in his hand. Every man have a two-edged sword in his hand. And it doesn't say to defeat enemies. It says, he goes on and he says, bind your kings with chains. How does that fit? How does that fit with what they're teaching in our churches today? It doesn't fit. I have a terrible reputation when it comes to Baptists. The bigger they are, the more I like to tangle with them. You know, if they teach it that government is the higher power, they've got a Bible with a contradiction in it, because that's a contradiction with Psalm 149. Don't let anybody kid you. God's law up here at the top. Laws of common sense. How many of you are business people and you carry a trunk full of law books with you every place you go, that you consult the law books before you make a deal, whether it's legal? You're dealing in common law, common sense. We know what's right and what's wrong. At least most of us do. We don't need all those law books. And I'll get to that a little later here. Then the laws of grammar. You have to have the laws governing the language. The IRS, they put out a book called The IRS Tax Audit Guide. They put it out in 1975, and the Commissioner of the IRS wrote a foreword for it, and he said, our tax system is based on individual self-assessment and voluntary compliance.
Yeah.
That was the Commissioner. That's the top man in the IRS, and he wrote it. A voluntary system? You go to jail if you don't volunteer. Isn't that an abuse of the language? It's a grammatical violation. They're good at it. Now, I'm going to go back again a little bit. What I said about Russia and them in 1963, the U.S. Supreme Court took prayer out of our government schools. You remember? A logical, a rational, or a proper decision since that time. We've got Vietnam and Somalia and Bosnia and Iraq and Iran or Afghanistan. We had reached the point there when the Roe v. Wade decision came in 73. 10 years later, they just reiterated what they'd done in 1963. I went and I read that entire decision when they took the prayer out of the schools. And there's a lot of verbiage there. A lot of words that they didn't need, because the way I read it, the Supreme Court said, thou shalt not have any other God before the federal God. That's what it reads to me. Go and read it yourself. You'll come to the same conclusion that I did. Thou shalt have no other gods before the federal God. I use that term quite regularly, the federal God. They're telling you what you can grow on your farm. They're telling you all kinds of things. You're not supposed to shoot a grizzly bear and all that kind of thing. And I've got a clipping here out of a newspaper in 1990, how the jury up in Montana, Great Falls, Montana, they prosecuted this rancher up there for shooting a grizzly. He went in there, it was no more self-defense than the man in the moon, but the jury, they said not guilty. 2.5 hours of deliberation. That's the best way to get rid of these wolves in Montana. They're eating our meat. They're killing off the moose and everything else just for a few miserable wolves. They're killing off the coyotes, they're killing off the fox. But they'll sacrifice the fox, they'll sacrifice the coyote, they'll sacrifice the elk and the deer, they'll sacrifice the moose, just for a few wolves. Laws of common sense. There it is, right there. Laws of common sense, laws of grammar. Okay, now I've got a line across there, and I say these are the higher laws. The lower law below that is the individual. We the people are the next in this pecking order in our society. This is what the founders gave us. This is the political system that they wanted us to pass on to future generations. They said vote number 1 is at the elections. They said you've got vote number 2. Vote number 2, the grand jury. Where's the grand jury? They're supposed to be up here. If you're on the grand jury and you don't know that you're supposed to be up here, you know where you're at? You're down there on the floor someplace, dumber than a pile of rocks. If you know and you're on a grand jury, you're going to make your vote count. You're not going to go away from that grand jury hearing feeling powerless. Vote number 3, your trial jury. We had that one income tax trial in 1980. This farmer was charged with 3 felony counts, and they had him dead to rights. The IRS, they had just set him up like a pigeon. The jury went out, and the first vote was 11-1.